Support for this episode of Judaism Unbound comes from the Oshman family JCC in Palo Alto, California, whose vision is to be the architects of the Jewish future. The Oshman family JCC empowers you to experience Jewish paths toward a life of joy, purpose, and meaning through innovative Jewish learning and wellness programs, community building, and initiatives to develop the next generation of Jewish leaders. Learn more at www.paloaltojcc.org. This is Judaism Unbound, episode 422, Purim 2024. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
I'm Lex Rofberg.
And I'm Miriam Charlinchant.
And we are here in it's our 9th year, right? We just had our 8th anniversary as a podcast. And in thinking about that, we decided to try out some new formats for the podcast, not instead of what we always do, but in addition to. So this is one of our little experiments that we were thinking that every once in a while, the three of us could get together and talk about a Jewish holiday or a Jewish practice or a text. But I would say that 8 years into this project, I feel like we're somebody. Like, we don't always have to have a guest to talk about these things. Like, we actually have learned a lot over the last 8 years, and we have opinions and
thoughts. New tagline, Judaism Unbound, we're somebody.
Yeah, so anyway, what we decided to do is really just because of an accident of the calendar, is that the first holiday that is taking place in our 9th year is Purim, which is coming up in a little under 2 weeks. And so we thought it would be interesting to just have a kind of unbound conversation about Purim. So as a way of jumping off, I was just thinking that it would be helpful, especially for folks who don't know that much about Purim, if we might be able to just say a few things about the Purim, as we've often talked about the Purim that has been, the Purim that we've received, before we start talking about what Purim should become or could become.
So here's my general sense of what Purim has been. Purim is a holiday that traces back a little more than a couple thousand years, and its origin story is traditionally tied to the Book of Esther. So the Book of Esther is from the writings section of the Tanakh, of the Hebrew Bible, and so it's in this sort of wild card third section called the writings, where there's just a lot of really good stories, and they're not all necessarily directly tied to each other. It's not like the Torah that's all one flowing narrative. It's just a scattered set of stories. And this scattered story takes place in Persia, which is interesting, in Shushan, a particular place in Persia, which is interesting because that's not the land of Canaan, the land of Israel. It's a diasporic, separate place. And most of the Bible takes place in the area that is the land of Canaan and then the land of Judah and Israel. So that's cool. And then there's this story that unfolds. And to distill it way too much, it's a roller coaster ride of a story where two heroes, Esther and Mordecai, help prevent a genocide of, I'm going to say, the Jews. They're not really called Jews, but like people of Judah or Judeans, people that are descended from the Israelites. They prevent this genocide from happening, and instead, sort of the evil villain who had been trying to make the genocide happen, Haman, is killed, as are his children, as are a whole slew of other people throughout the lands, not only of Persia, but of a bunch of other nearby provinces. So that's kind of the story. It ends on this really violent note, which is, for a lot of us who read it, challenging because the point is about preventing violence, but then we ourselves, or our ancestors, our proverbial ancestors, this is a novel. It's a fictional story.
What?
Right. Even for many people who see other things as more historical, it's a little less heretical to see this as a novel. But that's basically how it unfolds. And then we have a holiday that marks that story. It sort of remembers that story. And it includes reading that story out loud in community, eating a big old festive meal, giving gifts to the poor and to neighbors, to loved ones and friends. And what am I missing?
Hamantashen?
Yeah,
there's Hamantashen. There's cookies. And there's fasting the day before. The fast of Esther, one of our two heroes in the story, happens the day before Purim. That's kind of the Reader's Digest.
But there is at least one traditional food, which is a hamantash, which is a triangular cookie that has fillings in it, which may represent Haman's ear or Haman's pocket or something along those lines. And there's some element of this guy tried to kill us, so we're eating him.
Exactly.
I was prepared for this part of the conversation since Lex hates these cookies, and I
True.
think that's like a terrible thing because they're like soft and beautiful, but also
they're rarely soft.
I think if you've done right, they're soft, they're filled with beautiful, yummy jams. But I was he's shaking his head, y'all. But I also think I was reading about this, about their fertility culture of giving these cookies in the 18th century and how it was a marker of Ishtar and how we're giving to fertility, and that Esther, this heroine, could also be sort of connected in that way.
The more you look at any Jewish holiday or ritual, the more likely we should make a graph that's like amount of time exploring a ritual is the x-axis, and then likelihood it relates to fertility is the y-axis, and it's just a linear line where every holiday and ritual, the more you look at it, ties to
I
fertility.
love that. And I think it makes sense in this holiday because they say that at the end of times, I don't know who I'm talking about, I guess the rabbis, that the two holidays left would be Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, and Purim, and how they're different sort of versions of life and death and embodiment and spiritual life, and that there's some kind of tension there, I think, in fertility and what comes into the world.
Well, I actually want to jump off the fertility idea and explore whether maybe fertility is really what this holiday is about. And I want to do that with a little bit of a digression to Hanukkah. There is a text in the Talmud that talks about what I call the primordial Hanukkah. It was the first time Hanukkah was observed, and it was observed by Adam, the first human being. And the story in the Talmud says that Adam was noticing that as the winter proceeded, the days became shorter and shorter, and he was worried that that meant the world was ending. And then at a certain point, the days became longer and longer, after the solstice, and he was relieved that the days were getting longer again and the world wasn't ending, so he made a festival. And that's the festival that takes place at that time of year. And the implication is that only much, much later was it overlaid with a new story, the story of the Maccabees. So what is Hanukkah really about? Is it about the Maccabees, or is it actually about the solstice, right? Is it really about the time of year? And with Purim, I think we could ask a similar question, because Purim takes place in the Middle East at the beginning of spring. And fertility is obviously critical to the beginning of spring in those cultures. And my question ultimately is, was there a primordial Purim? And I think the answer is definitely yes. But was there a primordial Purim? The Jews were observing this holiday long before the book of Esther was ever written. And if that's the case, then my question is, Lex, you started out the explanation of what Purim is by giving the story of the book of Esther. And that's where most people would start it off. And my question ultimately is that right? Is that the way that we should think about it? Or are we kind of buying what we were sold? And actually a much better approach would be to say, look, what Purim is about is fertility. And that's why we have these cookies that look like genitalia and, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And later in time, people were uncomfortable with that, and so they added a story onto that was different.
I'm with you on that. I will say I was careful when I told this story. And I said the traditional way that this. I spoke about how it tends to be that the story starts with Esther. Look, I'm a believer, and we've talked about this on the podcast generally, that practices tend to predate stories. That when we have texts, when we have codified words, it tends to be that something probably was happening before that, and then the text was a product. It's not that the text was just sort of conceived by somebody, to use a fertility word, conceived. It's not that the text is just in somebody's head. They write a cool thing and then a practice comes. I think it is much more often the other way around, that we do things tied to the flow of time in our year, tied to other cultures around us, tied to whatever. And then we channel texts from it. So I'm with you that that's probably how this happened. We can't really prove or disprove that historically. But what I'm called to is, independent of how it started, I'm interested in making that more a part of what Purim is. I'm interested in the fact of Purim being late winter, because it's more late winter than early spring most of the time. This year, 2024, it is about the latest it can be in mid-late March. But even then, I live in New England, so I'm biased on this, but even then, it's still kind of winter vibes. I believe that we should be holding the time of year that Purim is more and thinking about how it serves us to have an emergence from winter holiday. And sure, we have a particular story that seems to connect to that in various ways, but I just like having a moment. March is my favorite month of the year, by the way, both because college basketball happens then and because it's the beginning of spring and I have a lot of seasonal affective things where winter is very hard for me. But I actually hold Purim as a seasonal time marker with more love than I do all the ins and outs of the practices that we tend to do.
I love that, Lex. I think with both cases, if we're saying the center of the holiday should encompass more fertility, could this emergent moment, Passover has conception, has fertility, has spring that's already built in, it's overlapping around Easter. We already have something like that. So could this moment actually be that liminal space of conception I think our story is quite problematic, but I love that the heroine is a female and that there is no sort of overarching moral to the story. The only thing I can think of is that that is oft quoted, which is Umi Yodea, like, who knows? I've reached this position in life for such a time as this. And I think there's something like that around fertility or the things that we bring into the world, that there's a moment of darkness and hibernation and then emergence. And perhaps some of the behaviors or routines of like the drunkenness and the fasting and the eating, like the excess around that is like all the different rhythms of life and sort of the human body sort of working its way through this.
I'm interested in the way y'all are using fertility. I wouldn't have independently from you used the word fertility. And like, I'll be transparent about it. There's people in my life who I care about very deeply for whom like the emphasis Jewishly on reproduction is really hard, and not just on like Jewish continuity, but even on like fertility metaphors and birth metaphors. And like one thing I actually love about the Purim story and Esther's role in it is that Esther is a woman, and she's one of the only women in well-known Jewish text whose core characteristic is that she's not a mother. We don't have some big narrative about how she has kids. This isn't a Hannah story that we read on Rosh Hashanah where the punchline is that she gives birth to somebody. This isn't a Sarah and Rebecca and Rachel and Leah where their main role is that they are the, progenitors of further people. Esther is herself. She's the only woman I can think of who like literally is a core piece of a big holiday for whom her role is not fertility. And so it's interesting. I wouldn't have thought of fertility as one of my primary spring markers. I do recognize that agriculturally is what a lot of cultures have associated with. But like, I'm curious if we can hold that piece in a differently layered way, because I'm nervous about fertility being what we would make the center of this.
No, I think that you're so right, Lex. I so appreciate you lifting that. I think that one of the dangers of using that word is that it, just like any other things we're using in Jewish life, that it gets, when you pull it down to the particular, it becomes personal and painful or problematic. But when it's lifted up and you think of fertility as a sense of creation in the world, that all of us have the ability to bring things to life and the world comes to life, and has actually nothing to do with children, but the act that we were made in this world and we continue to make in this world, and that's connected. So I think it's incredibly important to have named what you named, and also maybe to like go a little bit sort of broader with what we mean by that word, or find another one. So maybe we mean creation, like the Adam story.
Look, I mean, I agree with you, Lex, and I think it's interesting that having heard you say that, I'm like ready to dispense with fertility. Like, yeah, okay, that's not really where we want to be going for the future. But in the way that I'm really easy to dispense with fertility, which I'm arguing is the actual origin of this holiday, what I want to suggest for folks is to be equally ready to dispense with the Book of Esther if they find it problematic. And I am kind of pushing against a little bit, right? You talked about it earlier, that there are people who kind of don't like the Book of Esther these days because they really have a problem with the last chapter, really the second to last chapter of the Book of Esther, where the Jews kind of are freed from being genocided, and instead they sort of go to war and massacre their oppressors, their potential oppressors. And so there's a project by our friends at the Shalom Center, which, Miriam and I are participating in. You're on the board. I mean, we're into this, right? Which is to rewrite chapter 9 of the Book of Esther. And I'm into that. And I think that's a great project. But I also want to challenge us to say, hey, you know what? If we don't like the Book of Esther for various reasons, I can imagine a Purim without the Book of Esther. And if we want to have a story where a woman is the central character, let's move the Book of Ruth from Shavuot to Purim. And, that could have problems. I'm not advocating for that. But my point is that we could get creative. And as I was thinking about this, I thought about how every Jewish holiday has one of the writings attached to it. And for all the other holidays, most people don't even know which book is attached to it, like the Book of Ruth is attached to Shavuot or the Song of Songs.
I'd modify that. I think most people don't think of it. I think a lot of rabbis like try hard to like, yes, here's why Ecclesiastes is Sukkot. Yes, here's why Song of Songs is Passover. But like, I think you're right for most people.
Most people, but even most rabbis, like they don't understand that book to be like central to the nature of the holiday. And I wonder whether, in a sense, the Book of Esther just was a glitch in the system, in the sense that the Book of Esther somehow got promoted to being central to the nature of the holiday. Why that happened exactly, I have some theories. I don't know. But my point is that I don't actually think it would sort of do damage to the system to say, hey, let's have a different one of the writings attached to Purim. And my point is not that the Book of Ruth, for example, would then become central to the Purim story. My point is that Purim would then not have any story that was central to it, in the same way. I mean, you could say that Shavuot and Sukkot have a little bit of a story connected to them, but not really. That's not the main point of those holidays. It's not like we read a story. It's like we say Sukkot represents when we were living in the wilderness, and Shavuot represents when we received the Torah. So we could say, Purim represents when we something, and there's not a central narrative to it. And I would just sort of challenge us to imagine a holiday like that without the Book of Esther at the center and see if we came up with something cool.
I totally want to engage with that in an intellectual exercise, but emotionally, I hate that idea, Dan. Like, I love this story. It's so ridiculous. And I think that once we start excising the difficult narratives, we landed up in a place to whitewashing it, or like, I think personally, you can say what's relevant, not relevant to me. But once we say the story isn't relevant, I have a hard time with that, because I think the story is what carries us through. I know like one ways that I've navigated that is to rewrite it from all the silent characters. It was like, okay, it wasn't so great. I'm like watching in my body how like, oh, don't get rid of that story. But if you had said get rid of a practice, I'd be like, great, yeah, get rid of that practice. So I don't know why the story feels more sacred to me, because I can think of so many problematic texts that we don't excise and maybe I'm holding on to like, don't you know it's a joke? Like, it's a 6-month party of feasting. Like, can we sort of engage that a canonized book has no mention of God? There's central characters that are really vulnerable people, that they're joking the whole time and they thought that was holy. Like, I love that concept. So I guess if you took those ideas and said, can we make the holiday around comedy and joy and not taking ourselves so seriously, and that we have human agency, and oh yeah, let's not engage in revenge fantasies. Not just in this moment, but I think this should have been upsetting us for decades, for centuries. And I'm sure it has. I'm sure there's many people, but maybe this moment has awoken us in just such a time so that we can reinvent it.
I'm a little closer to Miriam than Dan on this. I want like a spectrum. We should, for future episodes, since we're setting our precedent of these Dan, Miriam, and Lex episodes, I feel like we'll have many spectra from one of us to the other of us and others in between. My suspicion, if we did the exercise, which I want to do, in my dream Jewish community, we would have one congregation or one community or one whatever group kick out the Book of Esther for the year. Not all the communities in that city. We would have one community that's like, okay, we're going to do the exercise of what is Purim if there's no Book of Esther. And I would want to do that, not because I actually dislike the Book of Esther. I don't like chapter 9, and I don't like how it's been used and the violent ways it's been used, including, by the way, like directly to kill people. Like this is not an abstract thing. It's not just like this could be mobilized for harm. It actually has in our own lifetimes. It makes me feel ashamed.
Yeah.
And I think that the story is probably going to emerge from that exercise not unscathed, but like we're still going to want to have it. There are ways in which this story can plant seeds of justice and love that are worth cherishing, but we should have one community totally ditch it because, and I do this with other things, like I'll post on my Facebook timeline some thought provokers sometimes, like, okay, what if you were marking Shabbat and the only things you're not allowed to do are go to services, read from the Torah, or eat a dinner with your family? I pick like the most common things, and I say those are not allowed, because that plants the seed of creativity. Like Shabbat actually could mean a lot of things. The exercise of saying you thought that Shabbat couldn't exist without a Friday night dinner or without services or without whatever. It can. Here's what it might look like. Purim should be the same. What would it look like if we don't allow ourselves to have the Book of Esther as a fallback? Like, that forces us to ask, what is Esther doing? What is that story doing for us? And if we couldn't achieve whatever it's doing through the book, how might we achieve it with other avenues?
Or not what is the Book of Esther trying to do, but what is this holiday trying to do, regardless of whether or not that's the same as what the Book of Esther is trying to do. Before I answer that question, I just want to make two more arguments for the willingness to get rid of it. One is that the rabbis did that with Hanukkah, right? The early rabbis tried to get rid of the Maccabee story and replace it with the menorah that didn't go out, the oil that lasted for 8 days.
And they succeeded at getting the book out of the getting Maccabees out of the holiday.
Yeah, the Book of Maccabees was not canonized into the Bible. But let's imagine whether we got rid of the Book of Esther or not. I want to look at the practices of the holiday, and I guess what is this time of year potentially calling on us to do? So I'm thinking about what is this time of year? Lex, I'm going back to what you were talking about in terms of it's the end of winter, not yet spring for us here in America, in Israel maybe it is, but we're getting ready for spring. And Passover's in a month, and that's definitely spring. And so we're starting to imagine coming out of our cocoon. And in a way, I think that potentially represents a certain kind of new year where we can say the winter's over. And by the way, when I've taught about the Jewish holidays, when you look at certain elements of the Jewish holidays, you see that arguably the way the Torah thinks of the year is that the year runs from Passover and ends with Sukkot. And it's not a cycle. It's from Passover to Sukkot. What is from Sukkot to Passover? And I think it's something other than the year.
Which is half the year, just for
it's half the year, but I think that they, in a certain way, didn't consider it part of the year. They considered it a dark time. And so the end of the dark time is an important time.
If only we had a text whose 8th chapter had a beautiful verse quoted every week at Havdalah that says, "For the Jews there was light."
Nice.
And we could anchor it.
That's from the Book of Esther, by the way.
The Book of Esther has a famous verse, "La Yehudim hayta ora," which means for the Jews there was light. It goes on like there was light and joy and whatever, which is quoted at the weekly Havdalah service on Saturday nights. And we could apply it to this holiday that is about emerging into a time of more light.
Nice. So I'm thinking about what kind of holiday practices would I want to sort of come back into the world after having spent the winter in more of a cocoon. And I'm wondering whether some of the Purim practices that we have, such as bringing gifts to friends, bringing gifts to the poor, maybe those can be better understood as me turning over a new leaf. I'm going to live in the world in a new way after this winter.
Yeah, I was thinking about that. I had two sort of images that came to mind. One is what the bear does after hibernation, which is not a very good thing. It's kind of gross, but it has to expend everything out of itself, right? In order to go and eat, right? So it's like this whole body thing. And I like that one of the elements of this holiday asks us to recognize the humans among us that we want to give joy to. And when I think of some of my earliest memories of this holiday, it's less about costumes or even the sing-songy spirit. It came down to these gifts that kind of looked like versions of each other. So I'm sure, Lex, you hated it, but like you have a cookie, and then I grew up in Seattle, so it was lots of satsumas and healthy things in it. And then in Ohio, it was like chocolate. So it depended on this thing. But I love this idea that the people in your midst would get something sweet. And I'm guessing when this came up that sugar was expensive and things like that were hard. But the idea is when we wake up and the first thing we do is express gratitude for other human beings. That's the most gracious, wonderful thing in the world.
Yeah, I love the practice of Mishloach Manot, of giving gifts to neighbors, friends, loved ones. Specifically, the experience of giving, because Mishloach Manot, it's usually practiced among communities of Jews. I think that's a fair statement most of the time. It is usually the case that people who give something called Mishloach Manot, which is to say specific kinds of gifts, there's usually food involved. You go to a bunch of your Jewish neighbors, you give them their little bag, they might come by, bring their little bag. It's an exchange for a lot of communities. For me, I live in close friendship and community with some Jews, but a lot of my close friends are not Jewish. And some years I've gone and gotten Mishloach Manot bags and given gifts Davka specifically to the folks who are not Jewish. It's not like I leave out the Jews, but more of my friends aren't Jewish in my local Providence community. And there's something really both disorienting and beautiful about giving a gift at a time that other people, they don't even know it's a holiday. It's just popping up out of nowhere. And it's awkward because they feel like they're supposed to give you something. And I'm saying no, it's actually a thing of this holiday that you give gifts to people and they don't have to give a thing back. It's fine. This is something I give to you. I've given it to neighbors, next door to me who they think I'm a Jehovah's Witness or something.
I've never received one. I've never received a gift from you.
Well, we don't live in the same local place.
I love that you would say that it's awkward, because I do think we live in a world where in this effort to be mutual, we think that it also is transactional. I give, you give back, right? Instead of saying hey, in my tradition, we give to people we love and we give them a little sweetness. And it's not like I went and spent $1 million on this. It's just something I have to offer. And in fact, the cookies are weird and personal, but it's not as weird as other, it could be gefilte fish. This could have been a very different situation for us.
I will say, I love that the cookies are weird. As I said, I don't like the taste of Hamantashen. The vibes are impeccable. The weirdness, the triangle.
I read that it was originally fried dough, like a donut, and that dipped in sugar, like a churro,
That would have been better.
That makes more sense to me that was what was successful.
If people made the argument to me that they know Hamantashen don't taste very good, but it's such an exquisitely strange food and it's fun to eat, I would be ready to be on that train. I find that a lot of people feel the need to tell me it tastes good. That's where I get lost.
So drama. I mean, I do think that there is something about how laborious it is to make them. I start that stuff several weeks beforehand because you make the dough and then the next day you make it takes time to put it together. And I think challah has some of that element to it too, where it isn't just poof and you make it. It's not like soup in that way, that there is something that is very intimate in its process that I think has relevance right now of what do we do that requires our actual fingers to fold and put together and knead? And that's also something we're offering, which is an intimacy in this process. Maybe that brings us back to creation. I don't know, but what we're trying to be calmness.
When we think about what kind of gifts should we be giving out, I had an idea the other day that we should give out the best book that we read this winter. In other words, that there could be things besides little candies that maybe we should give out or cookies that I just think if we spent a little more time thinking creatively about what we might give out, we could put a lot more meaning into this and, every holiday.
I like that, Dan. I think that to make it closer to the holiday, it would, if you gave them the book, it should include not what was your best one, but maybe something that spoke to them or write in their margins about how it relates. How can we make it even more personal about what we're offering?
Either one of those I love, and again, those might not be the only ideas. I think we can just think more creatively, but I think we tend to be kind of old school about things. And sometimes it's good to be old school, and sometimes it's just not allowing us to achieve the fullness of what this holiday can be about. I wanted to go back to the Book of Esther, though, for a little while, and not about getting rid of it, but actually more the opposite, embracing it. And I want to go back to how you opened this, Lex, and said it was a work of fiction. I think that there's an element where when we think about fiction in our lives, I know that when we were 12 years old, we sort of argued against this. I remember on the school bus being, it's not all about symbolism and it's not all about, metaphors, but it is. And, great fiction is about metaphors and symbolism. I think that a lot of us are reading the Book of Esther at the pshat level, right? What we call the surface level, the plain meaning. And when I polled some of my friends about what we should talk about today, one of them brought a great read, and he actually is a writer, and he sort of suggested that we look at the Book of Esther not on its surface level meaning, but for what it might be, a story that symbolizes Haman is the evil darkness of winter, right? And the coming out of winter is the defeat of Haman, et cetera, et cetera. And then the question for me is can we read the slaughter of the people in chapter 9 as metaphorical in some way? Now, the one thing that I want to say about whether we're reading it metaphorically or what you were saying earlier, Miriam, that it's humor, is that we live in a time where a lot of things that we thought were funny 30, 40 years ago that now people would be horrified to think that you would do that comedy show today. And it's no surprise that a piece of comedy from...
And to be clear, you're saying that's good that we've realized that.
Yeah, it's good that oh yeah, of course, it's good that we realize that. And so what I'm saying is, it's no surprise that a piece of comedy from 2,000 years ago might not quite land today the way it might have landed 2,000 years ago. And the same is potentially true if it's a story that is meant to be symbolic, but it was at a time when to say thousands of people were slaughtered was a way of symbolizing the end of winter. And now we wouldn't write the story that way anymore, because we have seen how stories like that can be read at the surface level by people who don't realize that it's fiction and who don't have that way of reading literature. And bad things have come of it. So I don't quite know what to do with it, but I do want to say, like, I would love it if we could really read the Book of Esther as literature and as symbolism. And that's where I would say about chapter 9, like, no, it's not meant to be read literally. Don't read it literally. Of course you shouldn't be killing other people.
Dan, I love that so much. I love how Narnia that is, which I guess is also Narnia is based on a biblical text, so it makes sense. I also don't know what kind of school bus you're on where you're arguing about fiction. Like,
yeah, I was also very confused but excited about your childhood, Dan.
Well, we were mad that the 7th grade teacher was telling us that we had to read symbols into everything.
Totally, that's exactly what I was talking about in 7th grade. Such a window into Dan. I love it. I was thinking, I love this idea of reading new memory. I'm curious when we talk about spiels, or like the way of telling the story, I don't know of any other holiday that we're trying, I guess Passover has some of this element of telling it in an evocative way, but we're not, the parodies and the energy that we're bringing into Passover, I feel like started with Purim. Isn't that an effort of doing that, to tell it in the tune of Be the Beatles or in Barbie or in all the different versions of it? Or do you think it's just slapping on another satire on top of a satire, not actually engaging it in a fictional way?
You can look at whatever anybody's doing and find meaning in it, but I worry that at the end of the day, people are taking this piece of comedy either too seriously or not seriously enough.
I'm really interested in comedy. I love comedy, but I think we have like a mood problem. We have an issue tonally with Purim, because yes, this story I think is a farce or a comedy, but I don't, maybe I'm not saying it's a farce. It's a comedy, but it's like a dark comedy.
Like the vibe is off?
Right, like I don't actually think, and I'm now talking about Esther again, and I'm acknowledging that like we don't need Esther to be the core of this holiday, but as long as we're talking in the past and present tense, it has been the core of the holiday. Like, I'm not totally convinced the fact that Esther has puns, which it does, and it has characters that are meant to be very silly. I mean, the king is clearly, the king is like a character we're supposed to be reading about and like laughing. This guy's not very intelligent, whatever. The takeaway from that for me is not that it's just like this lighthearted, I'm saying light on purpose because we were just talking about light and darkness. This lighthearted comedy. I think it's much more genre-wise like a dark comedy where people yell at each other. They debate whether, well, is it a dark comedy or is it actually like a thriller? They're not sure. And sure, there's moments where you watch like an intense dark comedy that are funny, but there's also moments of like suspense and maybe tragedy and where you're not feeling like happy-go-lucky. I think tonally, mood-wise, you walk into a synagogue space that is marking Purim across any denominational spectrum right now, almost anywhere in the world. People are dressed up in costumes meant to be fun, joyful. There is a lot of loud noise making. You know, you traditionally scream and yell at points in the story whenever Haman's name is said. We have pushed aside the darkness. Or maybe not pushed aside entirely, but we've decentered the darkness ritually. We don't have moments where we sit there meditating on the terribleness. We have moments where we yell and scream and boo at a bad guy. We need to find a different mood for this holiday. I'm not content, because what people say is like, well, there's folks who need to dress up and be in a farce mode in Jewish space. And I get that. Like, I have found personal meaning in dressing up and being happy-go-lucky on Purim. And when you take a story that is deeply violent and dark and pretend it's light, that's where violence comes. Like, you're diminishing a set of things that are harmful in the world. And so I'm still not on the team of like discard Esther, But I am on team, like, we got to sit with it differently. I'm probably not going to dress up in costume this year. I don't think I have it in me. I think, like, it wouldn't feel like, I think I was Roy Kent last year from Ted Lasso for Purim. Like, I can't be Roy Kent this year, given what's happening in the world, in this region.
I want to dislink the costuming from the Book of Esther. Like, that's what I'm trying to do, is to say, let's look at the practices of Purim and ask ourselves, are they drawn from the Book of Esther? Or is it just that the Book of Esther was woven into these practices that are valuable otherwise? So I can imagine a world where in the darkest of times, we should dress up as characters, but it's not for fun. It's for saying, what would a great thinker from the past tell us to do in this moment? So in a time of like war and horror, and it would be like having conversations where those people we would bring their spirit forward. And that doesn't have anything to do with the Book of Esther. It says like, there's actually something cool about, tapping into the ancestral wisdom. And once a year, we do that by actually occupying their personhood.
Passover does have that notion that we are embodying the story. I think maybe part of my issue is that on Purim, we're not actually inhabiting the story. We're usually dressing up as people do like the Purim spiel, but often it's like this very jovial, not non-serious, like the genre of most Purim spiels in the country is very much like, let's have parody songs from the most recent Disney movie and set it to Haman. We don't talk about Haman instead of we don't talk about Bruno. I'm not interested in that.
I would say that the levity of costuming and spiels, it's like, I think that stuff, it got unmoored from what it was ever really once about, or maybe it never was about that, but it could be about that. And that there's something really cool about a spiel, and it's not singing, we don't talk about Haman. It's like that, yes, that has already become unmoored from what it's trying to do. But like, we could say, particularly in a year where we don't feel very light, then we could ask ourselves, could these technologies be used in a way that would actually be effective? And maybe that's a way of reconnecting with their original intent, or maybe it's not their original intent. It's just an evolution of what they can become.
I think that's all powerful, Dan. I also think the two of you are kind of hard asses, like these poor people doing these amazing spiels. And I think that they're trying, and maybe there are times that we can dress up and actually be our true gender in places. Maybe there are ways that we can sing this and be silly and play music in ways we couldn't other places. And I think that are unlocking probably things that are not critical to the holiday, but maybe are critical to us as human beings in these spaces. As in every generation and every year, there's a different thing that speaks to us in the season we're in. And I think if we can concentrate on that idea that we're awakening into something new each year during this period of time, that's a way sort of to be able to engage in it creatively, which I think is what we've been talking about this whole time, without sort of dismissing the joy and the fun and the groggerness of it all.
So I do want to say, like, I am comfortable being a hard ass on this. And I want to say why. Like, on the Purim spiel piece, like, I have dear friends of mine that help conceive of Purim spiels. I grew up going to my congregations. I've participated in them and been in them myself. Like, I see the fun that happens in Purim spiels, and I do, in fact, think that it's bad that the most notable yearly commitment to theater of any kind that the collective Jewish people, or at least American Jews collectively have, is to do kitschy Broadway-themed or Disney-themed covers of the Book of Esther every year. I actually think that's not good.
No, I'm totally with you.
I want all of the people you're alluding to that like work hard on Purim spiels, and I'm sure some of you are listening. Like, I don't want you to come away with this and be like, wow, Lex thinks I'm wasting my time and doing bullshit. Like, I want that same commitment to go towards an actual deep, heartfelt theatrical production of some kind. And it can be fun. It can be fun and lighthearted. It's not that things that are fun and lighthearted can't be good, but when the whole thing is usually like, and I'm sure there are good Purim spiels out there. Send us the examples of good Purim spiels. But like, when the whole thing is like, oh, Lion King, but now it's Lion King Achashverosh. Oh, like, it's not a sincere attempt. It's and we deserve, like, the Jewish collective deserves the actual sincere attempts that would be beautiful. We're not ambitious enough.
I did this last year with a group of amazing musicians and writers. We wrote for months reimagining this thing. It was in a speakeasy in the back of a brothel and blah, 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 blah. All original music, all based in deep, deep study about what we wanted from this thing. And like maybe it was successful. It was successful for the artist who created it. One of the issues is it didn't feel or look or sound like Purim, quote unquote. That gets really hard of like, what do we mean? How do we manifest it? And how do we do that in a communal setting with shared communal norms and expectations of what we want from it? And so like in the theory, this is all great. In the practice, it's hard to find your people in these organized places when they're expecting something else.
I think that goes back to, the earliest themes of our podcast in terms of like how there are smaller sustaining kinds of changes where we work mostly from what people have learned to conceive of, in this case, Purim, like what they think of Purim as being. Yeah, it's easier to work from that framework and tweak some small things than it is to start up something new and say, surprise, this is Purim now. I think that we do, as a collective Jewish people, need to be building our muscles of invention and not just small change.
Yeah, and just to build on that, I mean, that's back to the early days of this podcast. I mean, that's where I think let's bring your brothel play to people who have never experienced Purim before, and they don't have a sense of what Purim feels like. And those are the people that, to my sense, are likely to become the core of a new approach. And yeah, it's really hard and maybe impossible for folks who already have a sense of what Purim is to change it, especially something as radical as removing the Book of Esther. But I would say, as a call out to people who this is the first time they're really hearing about Purim on this podcast, is don't just go and read the book, Judaism for Dummies or whatever, and try to do that. That maybe you can feel invited, and maybe it's even like a holy invitation because you might be building the Purim of the future to play around in other ways.
So we definitely could keep rolling on this for a long time. Whenever that's the case, my sense is you, the listeners, should be helping us move this conversation from its first movement into its second movement of the symphony. So send us seriously all of your Purim ideas. We've still got a little bit of time before Purim happens, so these could inform our own Purim experiences. But even if they don't, even if they just inform future years' Purim experiences, I'm really interested in revisiting this holiday. I think because of what's going on in Israel-Palestine right now, like there's an increased sense across the political spectrum of the weight of Purim this year. And that's leading some people to lean more into it. That's leading some people to feel alienated from it. I'm actually grateful that we have a sense of the weight, the heaviness of this day this year. I think that will be productive. And so my hope is that wherever you're at on the Book of Esther, on Purim spiels, all of it, that you have a meaningful Purim. I'm hopeful that for those of you that happy Purim feels like the goal, that you have a happy Purim. For those of you that feel like some other kind of Purim is really the dream this year, that you find that. And that you are in touch with us as we co-create it together. So we're going to close out this episode. Know that in the future, we're going to have many more of these about other holidays, other rituals, other texts. That's just sort of brainstorming sessions to try and revision the Jewish future together. And we really want those to be participatory, co-created experiences with all of you. So for all of our episodes, be in touch in any of the following ways, but especially for these. So there's our email addresses, dan@judaismunbound.com, lex@judaismunbound.com, miriam@judaismunbound.com. You can throw us all on an email. You can throw just one of us if you have a particular gripe with something one of us said. You can send us Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram messages. Our handles are @JudaismUnbound for all of those. And we're so grateful to you for joining us today. Thanks so much for listening. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.